In 2006, three fossil hunters pulled two dinosaur skeletons out of a Montana hillside, locked together as if they had died mid-fight. For the next 14 years, almost nobody was allowed to study them. Not because scientists lost interest, but because the fossils sat in the middle of a legal fight over who technically owned them, one that went all the way to a state Supreme Court before anyone could get close enough to answer the real question sitting inside that rock. What exactly was buried in that hillside? And did it actually match anything already sitting in a museum drawer? The site sits in the Hell Creek Formation near the town of Jordan in Garfield County, Montana, on a ranch owned by Laik and Marianne Murray. In June of 2006, rancher and fossil hunter Clayton Phipps, known locally as the Dinosaur Cowboy, was prospecting with his cousin Chad O'Connor and a friend named Mark Eatman, when O'Connor spotted a trail of bone fragments leading to a pelvis eroding out of the hillside. It belonged to a nearly complete Triceratops. Weeks into the dig, Phipps found something else nearby, a claw belonging to a small tyrannosaur buried right alongside it. Both animals showed injuries. A tooth from the tyrannosaur was even found embedded in the Triceratops. The two skeletons had been preserved together in the same position they died in, which is how the fossil earned its nickname, the Dueling Dinosaurs. Getting them out of the ground took 3 months of careful digging. All told, the fossils weighed close to 20 tons, so Phipps and his crew braced them with railroad ties, wrapped them in plaster field jackets the way professional paleontologists do, and hauled the pieces to a converted barn in northeastern Montana to be cleaned and prepared. Identifying the smaller predator wasn't simple, because paleontologists had already been arguing about that exact type of animal for nearly 20 years. Back in 1946, a partial skull found in the same Hell Creek Formation had been named Gorgosaurus lancensis. In 1988, researchers reclassified it under a new name, Nanotyrannus lancensis, arguing it represented its own small-bodied genus of Tyrannosaur. Other scientists pushed back almost immediately, arguing every so-called Nanotyrannus specimen was simply a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex still growing into an adult's proportions. The debate had run for decades with no resolution, and the Tyrannosaur half of the Dueling Dinosaurs fossil got tentatively filed under that same disputed name, sight unseen by most of the paleontology world, because almost nobody outside a small circle was allowed to examine it. That's where the 14 years come in. Phipps and the Murrays tried to sell the fossil directly to a museum, but no institution stepped up. In 2014, it went to auction at Bonham's in New York, drawing a bid of $5.5 million, short of the $6 million reserve price the sellers had set. It went unsold, and the specimen went right back into storage. Complicating things further, the Murrays owned the surface of their ranch, but only a third of the mineral rights beneath it. Two brothers named Jerry and Bo Severson owned the rest. When the Murrays tried to establish clear ownership of the fossils before attempting to sell them again, the Seversons argued the fossils legally counted as minerals, meaning they owned a share too. A federal court sided with the Murrays in 2016, ruling the fossils were part of the surface estate rather than the mineral estate. The Seversons appealed, and in 2018, a divided panel of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals reversed that ruling in the Seversons' favor by a 2-1 vote. The Murrays pushed for a larger rehearing before the full appeals court, and rather than decide a question of Montana property law on its own, the Ninth Circuit paused the case and asked the Montana Supreme Court to settle it instead, the only body with actual authority over what counts as a mineral under state law. If you learned something new, be sure to subscribe. In May of 2020, the Montana Supreme Court ruled 4-3 that dinosaur fossils are not minerals under state law, closing a fight that had run 6 years on top of the 8 years the fossil had already spent unstudied and unsold. With ownership finally settled, the Dueling Dinosaur specimen went to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and for the first time since 2006, paleontologists could actually study the bones instead of arguing over who was allowed to. What they found settled far more than one fossil's identity. Paleontologists Lindsay Zano and James Napoli examined the Tyrannosaur's bones under a microscope, looking for a feature called an external fundamental system, tightly packed growth rings that only appear once an animal has completely finished growing. If this was really a juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex still on its way to full size, those rings shouldn't have been there yet. They were. The animal was fully grown, despite measuring roughly half the length and about a tenth the body mass of an adult Tyrannosaurus rex. Zano put it plainly. There was no scenario in which this specific animal was ever going to grow into a Tyrannosaurus rex. Examining the skull further, the team also found more tooth sockets than any Tyrannosaurus rex has at any age, along with different pathways for nerves and sinuses, differences that get locked in during embryonic development and never change afterward. The team published their findings in the journal Nature in October of 2025, nearly 40 years after Nanotyrannus was first proposed as its own genus. Examining more than 200 additional Tyrannosaur fossils for the same study, Zano and Napoli found that a separate specimen, nicknamed Jane and long assumed to be another juvenile Tyrannosaurus rex, didn't actually match the Dueling Dinosaurs Tyrannosaur either. It was different enough to represent a second, previously unrecognized species entirely, which the team named Nanotyrannus letheus. Two distinct small-bodied Tyrannosaur species had been hiding in plain sight in the same rock formation as Tyrannosaurus rex for nearly 80 years, both mistaken for the same misunderstood age group instead of their own separate animals. The name itself hints at what made them different. Nanotyrannus letheus borrows from the river Lethe of Greek mythology, a nod to how long this second species stayed completely forgotten, filed away in a collection as just another juvenile that never got the chance to grow up. Barely 2 months later, a second, completely independent team reached the same conclusion using a completely different method. Paleontologist Christopher Griffin, working with researchers from Princeton University, the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and the Yale Peabody Museum, examined the original 1946 Nanotyrannus skull itself, the specimen every other Nanotyrannus fossil is formally compared against. Instead of limb bones, Griffin's team studied the hyoid, a small bone that supports the base of the tongue, and found it carried the same kind of internal growth record usually only read from arm and leg bones. That record showed the same thing Zano and Napoli had found in a completely different skeleton. Full maturity, not a juvenile still growing. Their study was published in the journal Science in December of 2025. Two teams, working from two entirely different specimens with two unrelated bone analysis techniques, landed on the same answer within 2 months of each other after nearly 40 years of argument. That timing matters because this debate had genuinely been ugly for decades. A 2020 study out of Oklahoma State University, using similar growth ring analysis on different Hell Creek specimens, had reached the opposite conclusion, arguing those animals were still growing rather than fully mature. That's exactly the kind of contradiction that made two independent teams landing on the same result, from two different bones, worth taking seriously. It doesn't erase every disputed fossil sitting in a museum drawer elsewhere, but for the two skeletons at the actual center of the debate, the Dueling Dinosaurs specimen and the original 1946 holotype skull, the evidence now points the same direction from both angles. What it means for Hell Creek is bigger than one dinosaur's identity. Tyrannosaurus rex wasn't hunting alone across the final million years before the asteroid impact. At roughly half the length and a tenth the body mass of an adult Tyrannosaurus rex, Nanotyrannus was built lighter and almost certainly faster, likely chasing down smaller, quicker prey that a Tyrannosaurus rex was too massive to bother with, splitting the ecosystem between two predators instead of leaving it to one. That second, smaller predator was moving through the same landscape the entire time, misfiled for decades as a child of the animal it actually lived and hunted alongside. It took a chance discovery, a 14-year legal fight, and two independent research teams working months apart to finally read what had been sitting in that Montana hillside since 2006, waiting on the outcome of a property dispute that had nothing to do with paleontology at all.